As much as I love books, film was really my first foray into understanding narrative stories. I worked in film. I spent a lot of my formative years around film. So while I read, I cannot help but make associations or connections between the books that I'm reading and movies that I have seen or that I have been a part of. So I have this crazy idea to make what I am calling the wine and cheese pairing list between classic books, popular books, and movies that I feel capture the same vibe, if you will forgive me the use of the word vibe. So today, we're going to talk about Mary Shelley's epic, incredible piece of fiction, Frankenstein, and talk about three movies that I feel capture the same vibe, themes, feelings, structure as that incredible piece of work. I'm not making judgments in terms of their quality, although I do like these three movies. Frankenstein is one of the classics of all classics. It stands above, in my opinion, but I do think that the three movies that I'm going to talk about have their own power and have their own power in their specific genres and are pretty influential in their own right. So without any further ado, if you like Frankenstein, I think that you will like Blade Runner. Blade Runner was released in 1982. It is a literary adaptation of its own. And I could have talked about the Philip K. Dick novel, If Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, but I feel that Blade Runner, as it's constructed in its film version, has a lot more in common with Frankenstein. Blade Runner is a neo-noir crime thriller drama. It is dripping with substance. It is dripping with style. It is one of the most stylized pieces of media to come out of the 1980s. It is so incredibly singular in the way that it was shot, in the way that it was edited and re-edited. There are like 7 versions of this film because the director didn't really get what he wanted in terms of the studio. They added in a useless, in my opinion, narration, and then they took the narration out, and then they re-added it, and then they re-edited it. If you're looking for a version to watch, I think the final edition or the director's edition are probably going to be as close to the product that the director wanted, but this film is absolutely incredibly beautiful. If there's one thing I can say about it, it is one of the most beautiful pieces of cinema that you will ever see. And so I hope that you can experience it on a wide screen. Don't go watching it on your phone. I mean, I hate that. I was a cinematographer, so in my heart of hearts, I would like you to watch it up on a big movie screen, but they're not showing it anymore. So hopefully you have a decent television that you can watch this on. You could take every single frame of this movie and hang it as art in your house. It is that beautiful and impactful. But it is not just all flair and no substance. There is also an incredible through-line story about what it means to be human, what it means to be manufactured. What is your destiny if you have been created by another human being, or if you have been created by God or the forces of the universe? What does that do to your destiny as a being? If you are created with a purpose in mind, as a lot of these androids are created, does that remove some of your agency, some of your humanness? Do you have a soul? Does this sound familiar to you? If you've read Frankenstein, you know that a lot of these similar themes are woven throughout Frankenstein itself. I see this, Blade Runner, as a spiritual successor to Frankenstein for a modern sci-fi audience. Now, these are just crazy connections that my mind is making, and other people may not think this way. But when I watch Blade Runner, the only thing that I can think about is the meme, which says, I'm trapped in a horrors of my own making, because we as humanity have decided to create a monster, have decided to create many monsters in the case of Blade Runner, and now we are having to deal with the consequences. Very similar to Dr. Frankenstein, very similar to the creation of life, to the playing God. There are so many concepts that are pretty much one for one between the book Frankenstein and the film Blade Runner that I find it fascinating that something written in the 1800s could feel so fresh and new, and when you repackage it for a sleek sci-fi aesthetic in 1982, it can basically be the same thing. That connection and the ability for art to continue to echo each other and itself, and for stories to build on top of each other, is something that I really love. So part of the reason why I'm making this series. I don't want to talk too much about the plot of Blade Runner because it's not really about the plot. Obviously, these are not the same plots. There's one monster in Frankenstein, there's many in Blade Runner, there's a whole, it's a detective story in Blade Runner where it's not so much of a plot of anything in Frankenstein. It is more so the feelings, the evocation of feeling and theme that you get from these two pieces that I think if you read things and watch things the way that I do, looking for connections, you will find them. They are very, very apparent. But I will say, Blade Runner is not just deep and profound, it is also incredibly entertaining. So it's a lot of fun to just watch. It is one of my favorite sci-fi movies of all time, and I think the follow-up, 2049, is good, almost just as good. It belongs in its own category, but when we're talking about spiritual successors, thematic successors to the question of the power of man to create life and what those consequences are on humanity, I don't know where else you could look except for Blade Runner. The second film on my list is an animated film. It is an animated, it's Ghost in the Shell, the 1995 version. No offense to Scarlett Johansson, but the remake was garbage, I guess for lack of a better word. If you're going to engage with this story, Ghost in the Shell, I would go to the source. I would go to 1995. If you want to think about Frankenstein through the perspective of Frankenstein's monster, Ghost in the Shell is an incredible place to look, to find a little bit more insight into your reading of Frankenstein. This is a movie about being something in a system, being a person in a system without really understanding your humanity or your agency. Again, very similar to Frankenstein's monster, which I feel like when reading Frankenstein, yes, Frankenstein's monster is always around, it's always present, but it may not be the thing that most people take away. For me personally, when I finish Frankenstein, it's all about the actions of the humans in the story in relation to the monster. Ghost in the Shell forces you to ask and take perspective more so on the monster, quote unquote, the entity that may not be human, but maybe reflects a lot of humanity back to you, if that makes sense. I'm trying to be very careful with the way that I describe a lot of these things because I don't want to spoil anything for you, but more so I want you to experience and come to these connections on your own, if the connections are there. I understand this may be a personal thing for me. You may watch Ghost in the Shell and say, you know what? I didn't see any Frankenstein in it. I didn't see anything even close. And that is your right. But my connection brain was firing immensely when I was watching Ghost in the Shell. And I think maybe the animation turns a lot of people off, but if you're willing to engage in other forms of storytelling, you will find that this is one of the better pieces of anime to have ever been made. And it is incredibly adult. It's not just that because it's animated, it's made for children. This is an adult story with adult themes, much like Frankenstein. And I think if you're willing to engage with it, and if you're willing to take the perspective of trying to find the humanity in our protagonist, you may then return to Frankenstein and have a different reading of the text. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I would highly recommend Ghost in the Shell. I would highly recommend Ghost in the Shell and then maybe a reread of Frankenstein with a different perspective. Give it a go if you got that much time, if you're looking for a project to do. Ghost in the Shell is my number 2 movie. I love it, and I think you'll probably like it too. Our third and final film on the list of the wine and cheese book and movie pairings is Ex Machina. Alex Garland's masterpiece, maybe, 2014, an incredible story. I think this one has the most in common with Frankenstein. If I was going to say, if you're looking for more of a one-to-one retelling, you're not going to find exactly a one-to-one retelling, but this one feels the most similar in my opinion, because it is about the creation of AI, the creation of humanized AI. It is these questions that Frankenstein maybe winks at or hints at as you're reading through the narrative are thrust directly in front of you with Ex Machina. The relationships between androids and humans force the viewer to ask the questions of, are we sure that just because we have developed a machine the way that humans define machinery, that this machine does not have its own agency, autonomy, if we want to go into the spiritual, does not have its own soul? These are questions that Frankenstein is asking purely, but it is also kind of asking them in a way that was appropriate for 1830, I believe was when Frankenstein was written. In Ex Machina, we have so much more technology. 2014, I mean, the film is a film. Like in 1830, we didn't have those, right? So just from the fact that we have made so much technological advance, and even now from where I'm sitting in 2025, we have made even further technological advances, and these AI generated android type human-like robots are a reality. Not so much science fiction, these things are happening. So these questions need to continue to be asked. And I think a lot of people find it easier to ask these questions if they are offered to you through media. So, as we read Frankenstein and as we rewatch Ex Machina, ask yourself these questions. In the same way that I talked about the beauty of Blade Runner, Ex Machina is beautiful in its stark contrast. Blade Runner is neon and neo-noir and futuristic, and Ex Machina is more contained, it's more sterile, but it is still incredibly hauntingly beautiful. There are frames, and there's one section in particular that does enter into the neon, fantastical side of science fiction, but for the most part, it is a very self-contained, subdued, scientific science fiction story. And I think that that's brilliant because it doesn't allow the artifice of the film, which is entertaining in its own right and very well acted and very well directed, but it doesn't allow the artifice to kind of get in the way of the audience asking the questions of, well, what would I do in this situation if I were faced with an android who looks like a human, who acts like a human? Can I even be sure that I am not an android? How do I know that I am a human if I'm looking at this thing that is incredibly human-like? And I think when we look at Frankenstein and we see Dr. Frankenstein seeing humanity reflected back to him and the horrors of humanity reflected back to him by the creation that he has made, he starts to ask himself these questions. What is humanity? What are humans? If I have created something that seems to be docile, that seems to be just wanting to live in a world where they can make their own choices, very similar to androids in Ex Machina, then the creator of those things has to look back and ask themselves, well, who is really the human here? Who is really the creation here? And I think that Ex Machina does such a good job flipping things on its head. Obviously, it's not reanimated corpses. It's a motherboard and, skin, basically, prosthetic skin. But it's the same concept. And I think that the creator in Ex Machina takes more of a villainous role, which is a way that you can read Frankenstein and read into Dr. Frankenstein himself, but I think that it is thrust upon you better because we get an outside perspective in Ex Machina. I would encourage you to go and check this film out. I think it is fantastic. One of the better films of the 2010s that I feel like gets some flowers but doesn't get the recognition that it deserves, especially in the sci-fi genre. This thing is beautiful, and it's so well written, and it is so well acted. It is people at the peak of their powers doing film the way that it needs to be done. Go check it out. Let me know if you find any of the connections that I have found in any of these films, or if you have found other films that you feel embody the spirit of Frankenstein. Now, obviously, there are one-to-one adaptations, film adaptations of Frankenstein. There are monster movies, there are Bride of Frankenstein, there are comedic tropes when you talk about young Frankenstein. So Frankenstein as a property has been adapted one-to-one, more of a real, true-to-life adaptation. But for me personally, none of those really work because the original text is just so rich. And as close as you can get to the original text, I would still prefer to read the original text. Adaptations are tricky for me, but when we're talking about spiritual successors or thematic successors, I did my best to find 3 movies that I think really capture the flavor of Frankenstein. So if you have some that you feel do a better job, please leave them down in the comments. Let me know what you think of this series. I want to do it for a ton of different books. Like I said, I'm a film guy first and foremost, and I have recently come into my reading world. So making those connections just feels very natural to me. Let me know what you think about this. I'd love to make this an ongoing series. Let me know if you think of any books that you feel have a wealth of themes that would be, interesting to look at if there are thematic successors in the world of film. That would be awesome. I hope you're reading something that is very, very good, and I will see you in the next video.